On the dry hills of the American Southwest, in the heat that rises off the rock at noon, something is waking inside a hollow wall. It is no larger than a grain of rice. It carries a drop of venom too small to matter. And yet when it pours out by the thousands, it has driven grown men off cliffs, drowned them in rivers, and killed where no lion or snake ever could. This is the Africanized honeybee, the killer bee. And almost everything you fear about it is true, though never for the reason you think. It did not crawl out of some ancient jungle. It was made, built in a laboratory by a man who wanted to help, released by accident, and then it did what nothing was supposed to do. It spread across a continent and then another, faster than anyone predicted, until it reached us. Tonight the hive turns, and we stand close enough to watch it happen. A single honeybee is almost nothing. You could hold one in your palm and feel only a tickle, a flicker of wings, the faint weight of an insect that lives a few short weeks. Its sting hurts, then fades. Most people forget it by morning. This is the bee we know. The bee on the cereal box, the bee in the garden, the gentle worker bumbling from flower to flower. The killer bee looks exactly the same. Side by side, you could not tell them apart. A scientist needs a microscope and careful measurement to be sure. The difference is not in the body. It is in the temper. It is in what happens when something disturbs the hive, and how many of them decide that something must die. Because a killer bee alone is harmless. A killer bee colony is one of the most aggressive defensive forces in the natural world. The weapon was never the insect. The weapon is the crowd. The venom of the Africanized honeybee is not especially strong. Drop for drop, it is nearly identical to the venom of the ordinary European honeybee. The same melittin, the same swelling, the same brief fire under the skin. A single sting from a killer bee is no more dangerous than a single sting from the bee in your backyard. That fact has fooled people for decades. The danger was never in the dose. It is in the multiplication. A healthy adult can survive a startling number of stings. Researchers estimate the lethal threshold at roughly 9 stings for every pound of body weight. For a grown man, that means somewhere over 1,000 stings before the venom alone is likely to kill. It sounds like an impossible number. A safe number. Surely nothing could deliver 1,000 stings. A disturbed, Africanized colony can deliver that in under 2 minutes. Picture it as a single glass of water. Harmless. You could drink 100 of them. But 1,000 glasses poured all at once from every direction, faster than you can run, that is not a drink anymore. That is a flood. The killer bee did not invent a deadlier poison. It simply learned to bring more of it faster and to never ever stop. When you approach an ordinary beehive, you can usually get fairly close before anything happens. Beekeepers walk among European colonies in shirt sleeves, lifting frames, breathing easy. Those bees guard a small zone right at the entrance. Step back, and the danger steps back with you. The Africanized hive does not work that way. Its guards patrol a radius far wider than the nest itself. Researchers have measured defensive responses triggered from 60, 80, even 100 feet away. You do not have to touch the hive. You do not have to see the hive. You can be standing in a field unaware that anything is wrong, already deep inside the territory they have decided to defend. That is the first cruelty of the killer bee. It moves the border. The safe distance that has kept humans and bees at peace for 10,000 years, it erased it. From above, the perimeter would look like a wide, invisible ring around a crack in a wall, a fence post, a discarded tire holding rainwater. Cross that line and the hum changes. And the first scouts are already lifting into the air to meet you. Most animals, when they fight to make you leave. The threat goes away and the aggression ends. The bear returns to its cubs. The snake slides back under its rock. The point of the violence was distance, and once it has distance, the violence stops. The Africanized honeybee does not follow that rule. When it commits to an attack, leaving is not enough. It pursues. A European honeybee will chase an intruder maybe 20 or 30 feet before giving up. A killer bee colony will follow a fleeing victim. The length of several football fields' documented pursuits stretch a quarter-mile and beyond. They do not lose interest. They do not turn back at some boundary. They follow the movement, the carbon dioxide, the smell of fear written in sweat, and they keep coming long after you believe you have escaped. This is what makes them so dangerous to the very people most likely to encounter them. The instinct to run is correct, but running is not the end of it. You can clear the hive, clear the property, clear the road, and look back to find the dark clouds still behind you, still closing, riding the air at the speed of a sprinting man. For them, the fight is not over when you leave. It is over when they decide. They have a name now in the medical literature: mass envenomation. It is the clinical term for what happens when hundreds or thousands of stings enter a body at once, and it describes a kind of death that barely existed in North America before these bees arrived. Since the Africanized honeybee crossed into the United States in the early 1990s, it has been linked to a slow, scattered toll of human deaths, dozens confirmed, likely more uncounted, spread across the southern states from Texas to California. Across the Americas as a whole, from the original escape in Brazil, the number reaches into the thousands. Exact figures are impossible. Many victims are remote, rural, found too late. What the record shows is a particular kind of victim: the elderly who cannot run, the very young, people with mobility limits trapped in a yard or a field, workers who disturbed a hidden colony with a machine and could not get clear in time. Rarely the careless, usually the unlucky. Scientists and public health officials still debate exactly how to count these deaths because so many happen far from hospitals and witnesses. What no one debates is the shape of the threat. It is not a creature that hunts you. It is a creature you wander into. And the ones who die are most often the ones who simply could not get away fast enough. There is an old piece of advice passed around for generations: if bees come after you, jump in the water. Hold your breath. Wait them out. Against ordinary bees it sometimes works. Against killer bees it can kill you. The Africanized honeybee does not give up and leave because you have disappeared beneath the surface. It hovers over the spot where you went under, waiting in the air, drawn to the disturbance and the breath you will eventually need. Every time you surface for air, they are there. People have been found drowned not because they could not swim, but because the swarm above the water never dispersed, and the choice became stay under and suffocate or rise and be stung. It is a horrible kind of patience for an insect to possess. There is no malice in it. A bee cannot plan, an ambush cannot reason about your lungs. It is simply tuned to stay near the threat until the threat is gone, and a swimmer holding still in a pond reads to a bee as a threat that has not yet left. The instinct that protects the hive becomes, for the person in the water, a trap with no exit but up. The first sting is not just an injury. It is a signal. When an Africanized honeybee drives its stinger into you, it releases a scent along with the venom, an alarm pheromone, a chemical alarm bell that smells faintly like bananas. That scent does not drift and fade. It marks you. It paints a target on the exact spot where the first bee struck, and it tells every other bee in the colony, in a language older than words, here. Attack here. The enemy is here. This is why killer bee attacks escalate the way they do. One sting becomes 10, 10 becomes 100, not by chance, but by chemistry. Each new bee that stings adds more of the scent, and the signal grows louder, and more bees come to answer it. The wound recruits its own reinforcements. It also means the worst thing you can do is stand and swat. Crushing a bee against your skin releases the same alarm scent in a burst, broadcasting your position even more strongly. The smell clings to clothing, to hair, to sweat. Victims have reported the swarm fixating on them long after they fled, and part of the answer is simple. They were still wearing the scent that said, in the only word the colony knows, here. We talk about killer bees as a threat to people, but the bodies most often found are not human. Livestock die first and die most. A tethered goat, a penned horse, a chained dog, a calf in a pen. Animals that cannot flee, cannot clear the defensive zone, cannot do the one thing that might save them. When a colony erupts near an animal that is tied or fenced, the outcome is almost always the same. The stings come in the hundreds, then the thousands, and the animal has nowhere to go. Ranchers across the southern United States and Latin America have walked out to their fields and found prize animals dead overnight, with no wound, no predator, no sign of struggle, but a strange stillness and the faint banana smell still hanging in the air. Horses, the fastest of them, sometimes break free and run, and even then the swarm follows, and the animal can gallop itself to exhaustion or panic before the bees relent. Stand at the edge of such a pen the morning after, and the silence is the loudest part. No flies yet, no sound, just an animal that was alive at dusk, and a hollow in a nearby wall where even now the colony hums on, intact, undiminished, having lost only the few hundred workers it could easily spare. Speed is the part people never believe until they have seen it. An ordinary European colony disturbed takes its time. A few guards investigate. If the threat persists, more join building over a minute or two into a defense. There is a grace period, a window, where a person can recognize the danger and back away before things turn serious. The Africanized colony skips the grace period. Within seconds of a serious disturbance, a vibration, a blow to the nest, a shadow at the entrance, the response is not a few guards but a wave. Where a European hive might send a few dozen defenders, the Africanized hive can launch hundreds in the same span of time. The escalation that takes a European colony minutes takes a killer bee colony almost no time at all. This is the cruel mathematics of the encounter. The very feature that lets you survive an ordinary hive, the slow build, the warning, the chance to retreat, is the feature these bees have erased. By the time you understand what you have walked into, the air is already full. There is no moment of rising tension to read, no gradual hum to warn you. There is the before and there is the after, and almost nothing in between. Why so many? That is the question underneath all the others. Why does this bee throw 10 times the force at a threat that an ordinary bee would shrug off? The answer is written in where it came from. The Africanized honeybee descends from a subspecies that evolved in sub-Saharan Africa, in a landscape thick with honey badgers, rattles, baboons, and human honey hunters, predators relentless and clever, all of them hungry for the pru's colony's stores. A hive that defended itself politely in that world did not survive. The hives that lived were the ones that answered every threat with overwhelming, immediate, disproportionate force. So the trait was sharpened over countless generations. Send everyone. Send them now. Make the cost of touching this hive so high that nothing tries twice. In Africa, against a honey badger, that strategy is perfect. The badger learns, retreats, survives, and the colony survives with it. The violence has a purpose and an end. The tragedy is that the same response transplanted to the suburbs of Texas, aimed not at a badger, but at a child on a bicycle or an old man with a lawnmower, is wildly, catastrophically out of proportion. The bee is not malfunctioning. It is doing exactly what kept it alive for 1 million years. It simply no longer knows what it is fighting. There are people who have survived more than 1,000 stings. There are people who have died from far fewer. The record holds astonishing extremes. A man in the southwestern United States attacked while clearing brush was stung well over 1,000 times and lived, pulled out, hospitalized, his blood scrubbed and supported for days while his body fought the venom load. The human body, it turns out, can endure an almost unimaginable amount of poison if everything else goes right. But everything rarely goes right. Others have died from a few hundred stings or fewer when the venom triggered something the count alone cannot predict. An allergic reaction can kill in minutes from a single sting, anaphylaxis, the throat closing, the blood pressure collapsing. For those people, the 1,000 sting threshold is meaningless. One is enough, so there is no safe number. The survivor and the victim might have taken the same dose on the same day, and the difference between them was written in their own biology, a sensitivity they may never have known they carried. This is the quiet horror underneath the statistics. The bees do not choose. They deliver the same venom to everyone. What the venom does, once it is inside, depends on a lottery no one can see being drawn. People who have been through it describe the sound first. Before the stings, before the pain, there is the noise, a hum that is wrong. A normal hive hums low and steady, a sound almost soothing the white noise of 10,000 wings at work. When an Africanized colony goes to war, that sound changes. It climbs in pitch. It sharpens into something that survivors describe as a roar, a high electric drone that fills the air and seems to come from everywhere at once. You hear it before you understand it. By the time the mind catches up, by the time the word times, bees times forms, the sound is already on top of you because the thing's making it move at the speed of a thrown stone. That shift in pitch is real and measurable. It is the sound of a colony's flight changing from foraging to defense, thousands of wing beats accelerating together. Beekeepers learn to fear it. They will tell you that you can be standing at a hive, everything calm, and hear that note rise, and the only correct response is to already be moving, because the sound is not a warning that comes before the attack. The sound times is times the attack arriving at the same instant as the bees. They go for the head. In attack after attack, the stings cluster on the face, the scalp, the neck, the ears, the highest, darkest, most exhaling part of a fleeing human. This is not cruelty and not coincidence. It is the same set of instincts that served the bee against every animal that ever raided its hive. Bees are drawn to carbon dioxide, and the breath pours from your mouth and nose in a plume that marks exactly where your face is. They are drawn to dark colors and dark shapes, and the head with its hair reads as the darkest target. They are drawn to motion and to the high point of a moving thing. Put those instincts together, and they converge again and again on the one part of you that you most need to protect. It is why the standard advice in killer bee country is to pull your shirt up over your face as you run to trade stings on the body, which you can survive in great numbers, for stings on the airway, and the eyes which you cannot. Survivors often lose count of the stings on their arms and back. What they remember, what nearly killed some of them, is the swarm pressing in around the nose and mouth, drawn by the very breath they needed to keep running. 9 stings per pound. That is the figure researchers return to when they try to define the line between survivable and lethal. Roughly 9 stings for every pound of body weight before the venom dose alone threatens to kill an otherwise healthy person. Do the arithmetic, and it is almost reassuring. A 200-pound man would need around 1,800 stings. A child of 50 pounds, around 450. These are large numbers. They sound like safety, but the arithmetic cuts the other way for the small. The same swarm, the same furious 2 minutes, delivers stings without regard to the size of who receives them. A grown man and a small child standing in the same yard take the same volume of fire. The man's body has the mass to absorb it. The child's does not. The lethal threshold arrives far sooner for the small, the old, the already ill, the bodies with less margin to spend. This is why the victims skew the way they do. It is not that the bees seek out the vulnerable. It is that the dose is blind, and the same blind dose that a large, healthy adult can survive is for a smaller body, simply more than it was ever built to hold. Some of the people who die never went near a hive. The defensive radius, the pursuit, the alarm scent that travels on the wind together, they mean that a killer bee attack can find a person who did nothing, touched nothing, saw nothing. A gardener 3 houses down, a jogger on a trail that happened to pass within the perimeter, a man mowing his own lawn who never knew a colony had moved into the wall of his shed. This is the part that unsettles people the most. We can accept danger that we provoke. There is a logic to it. Disturb the hive, pay the price. But the killer bee breaks that contract. It extends its violence outward past the nest, past the obvious, into a zone where the victim has no warning and no fault. The trigger might be a passing truck, a barking dog, a vibration from machinery half a block away that the person never connected to the insects now rising to answer it. Researchers who study these incidents find the same pattern repeated. The victim again and again had no idea the colony was there. The hive in the hollow of a backyard tree that had stood quiet and unremarkable for a year The danger is not announced, it is discovered all at once, by someone who was simply in the wrong place when the air decided to fill. We keep using the word relentless, and it is worth pausing on what that really means, because it is the trait that separates these bees from nearly everything else that can hurt us. Most dangerous animals have an off switch. Satisfy the threat condition, retreat, submit, freeze, flee far enough, and the danger ends. The system resets. This is how prey and predator and territory have worked for as long as there have been animals to defend a patch of ground. Aggression is expensive, and nature does not spend it longer than it must. The Africanized colony spends it longer. Once the alarm is fully raised, the response does not taper quickly the way an ordinary hive's does. The bees remain agitated, remain airborne, remain ready to attack anything that moves nearby for far longer after the trigger is gone. A colony can stay dangerously defensive for hours after a single disturbance, long after the original threat has fled and forgotten. For the person who stumbles in late, the neighbor who comes to see what the commotion was, the rescuer arriving to help, this is its own hidden danger. The hive does not know the first victim has gone. It only knows it was attacked and that the air is still full of the scent of its own alarm, and so it stays armed, hanging over its territory, waiting for the next thing to cross the line. It is worth saying plainly, because the legend has grown taller than the truth. A killer bee is not a different, deadlier kind of poison wearing a familiar disguise. For years, in the rumor and the late-night talk, the Africanized bee became something almost supernatural, a mutant, a superbug, a thing with venom engineered to kill. None of that is so. Tested in the laboratory sting for sting, its venom is essentially the same as the gentle honeybees. Its body carries no special toxin, no enhanced poison, no biological upgrade to the weapon itself. What changed was never the chemistry. It was the behavior. Every part of the danger lives in temperament, not in toxin, in how readily, how massively, how persistently the colony chooses to fight. This matters because it tells us what we are actually dealing with. Not a poison to be neutralized, but a behavior to be avoided. You cannot make the venom safer, but you can understand the rules of the temper, the radius, the trigger, the pursuit, the scent, and almost everyone who dies is someone who, through no fault of their own, did not know those rules in time. The triggers are smaller than you would think. It does not take a thrown rock or a poked nest to set an Africanized colony off. The thing they react to most reliably is not an attack at all. It is vibration. The rumble of an engine, the whine of a string trimmer, the percussion of a lawnmower, a leaf blower, a tractor, a chainsaw, the ordinary machinery of a Saturday afternoon carrying through the ground and the air into the nest as a deep, alarming shudder. To the colony, that shudder reads as a large animal tearing at the hive. The honey badger scaled up, and it answers accordingly with everything it has aimed at the source of the shaking. This is why so many victims are found beside running machines, the mower still idling, the trimmer still in hand. The man was not hunting bees, not bothering them, not even aware of them. He was cutting his grass, and the vibration he made doing it spoke in the only language the hive understands, as a declaration of war. There is a grim lesson buried in it for anyone living where these bees have spread. The dangerous act is not approaching the hive. It is making the ground shake near a hive you never knew was there. For a long time, the killer bee was a foreign problem, a story from Brazil, then from Mexico, then from somewhere south and far away. That changed in the early 1990s. In 1990, the Africanized honeybee crossed the border into southern Texas, completing a march that had begun decades earlier and thousands of miles to the south. Within a few years, the first deaths on United States soil began to appear in the record. Among them, an elderly man in the southwest, attacked near his home, overwhelmed before help could reach him. The thing that had been a documentary curiosity became a local hazard, a line item in regional medicine, a reason for new warning signs along desert trails. From Texas, the bees pressed outward year by year into New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, California, Florida, wherever the winters were mild enough to let a colony survive. The map of their range filled in slowly, relentlessly, the same way the colony itself fills the air. Not a sudden invasion, a steady, grinding advance, and it is still going. The story did not end with their arrival. The northern edge of their range is still being drawn, still being tested against the cold, still creeping into places that a generation ago would have called the killer bee someone else's problem. The march that started in Brazil is not finished. It is simply paused at the frost line waiting. So stand there for a moment at the scene of it. A backyard in the dry country. Afternoon heat. A man behind a lawnmower, headphones on, thinking about nothing, the machine throwing up a fine green spray. In the wall of the shed behind him, in a hollow he has walked past 100 times, the vibration arrives like an earthquake, and a colony that has lived there quietly for 8 months decides all at once that it is under attack. The first he knows of it is the sound, that wrong rising hum climbing into a roar. Then the air around his head is no longer empty. The stings begin at the scalp and the neck where his breath has marked him, and the alarm scent blooms with the first wound and calls the rest. He drops the mower and runs, and the dark cloud comes off the shed wall and follows, riding the air at the speed of his own sprint, painting him with banana-sweet alarm, going for the face, the breath, the eyes. He clears the yard. He clears the fence. They are still with him. This is the moment the rules decide everything, whether he knows to cover his face, whether there is shelter close enough, whether his body carries some hidden sensitivity that will turn a survivable dose into a fatal one. He did everything ordinary. He cut his grass, and he wandered without knowing it, into the strangest fact about this animal of all, that its terror is real, and its body is a marvel, and the reason it is here at all is that we deliberately went and brought it. Here is the strangest bargain in the insect world. The honeybee's sting is a one-way trip. When a worker drives her stinger into your skin, the tip is not a smooth needle but a barbed harpoon lined with tiny backward-facing hooks. Going in is easy. Coming out is not. When the bee tries to pull free, the barbs catch in the flesh and hold. She tears away, and the entire sting apparatus rips out of her body with it. Stinger venom, sac muscles, a piece of her abdomen, all of it left behind, still buried in you. The bee flies off mortally wounded and dies within minutes. She has, in the most literal sense, given her life to land a single sting. And the Africanized bee does this exactly as readily as any other honeybee, which means every defender that reaches you is spending itself to mark you. Stand at the scene afterward, and the skin is studded with these abandoned stings, each one a small white thread still working. The colony pays for its defense in bodies. It simply has so many to spend that the cost barely registers. The cruelty of the design does not end when the bee dies. It is only getting started. That torn-away sting apparatus is not inert. It is a machine that keeps running without the bee attached. The venom sac left behind in your skin continues to contract, a small muscular pump squeezing on its own, driving venom deeper into the wound for up to a minute after the bee that delivered it has flown off to die. This is why the standard medical advice is to get the stings out fast and to scrape rather than pinch, because grabbing the sac to pull it can squeeze the last of the venom in finishing the job the bee started. The sting works the dead bee's will long after the will is gone. Multiply that by 1,000. In a serious attack, the skin is not holding 1,000 quick jabs that are over and done. It is holding 1,000 tiny pumps, each one still working, each one emptying its reservoir into the body for the next 60 seconds. The dose does not arrive all at once and stop. It keeps coming from 100 small machines that no longer need their makers, long after the air has cleared. Look closer at that abandoned engine, and it gets stranger still. The whole sting unit is a self-contained weapon system. There is the lancet, the barbed shaft that anchors in the wound. There is the bulb of the venom sac swollen with poison, and around it a sheath of muscle wired to a knot of nerve tissue, a tiny scrap of nervous system that stays alive and active even after the bee is torn in two. That nerve cluster keeps firing. It keeps the muscles squeezing in rhythm, keeps the lancet ratcheting deeper on its barbs, keeps the venom flowing, a severed fragment of an animal still carrying out its last order with no brain left to give it. Researchers have watched these detached stings pulse on a glass slide, working away at nothing for minutes. There is something deeply uncanny in it. We expect a weapon to need a wielder. We expect death to be the end of action. The honeybee's sting is a small machine that violates both rules, a piece of an insect that goes on attacking after the insect is gone, driven by a sliver of nerve that does not know and cannot know that there is nothing left of the creature it once belonged to. So what is actually in that pumping sac? Not one poison, but a mixture, and the headliner is a molecule called melittin. Melittin is the most abundant ingredient in bee venom, and it is the reason a sting burns the way it does. It is a tiny protein built to do one terrible thing: punch holes in cells. It slots into the outer membrane of your cells and tears it open, spilling their contents, killing them from the outside in. That is the fire you feel: cells rupturing in a widening ring around the puncture. Alongside it ride other weapons. An enzyme that breaks down the cement, holding your tissues together, helping the venom spread. A compound that triggers the release of histamine, swelling the flesh and dropping the blood pressure. A molecule that ramps up pain directly. It is not a poison so much as a coordinated chemical assault, each component amplifying the others. In a single sting, the dose is trivial: a flash of pain, a welt gone by tomorrow. But every one of those 1,000 pumping sacs is delivering the same cocktail. And at that volume, melittin stops being a nuisance and becomes a genuine threat to the blood, the muscle, the kidneys. The molecule does not change. Only the number does. Leave the sting behind now and look at the head, because the bee's senses are as alien as its weapon. A honey bee does not see the world as you do. Its two large compound eyes are each built from thousands of separate light-detecting units packed together like a honeycomb of their own, every one pointing in a slightly different direction. The image they assemble is coarse. A bee could not read this sentence from any distance, but it is exquisitely fast, and it is tuned to things our eyes ignore entirely. A bee sees ultraviolet. Flowers that look plain to us blaze with hidden patterns under that light, runways and bullseyes painted in wavelengths we cannot perceive, guiding the bee to the nectar. The world a bee moves through is lit by colors that for us do not exist, and those thousands of units make the eye a superb motion detector. A bee can track movement far faster than we can, which is exactly why swatting fails. To the bee, your hand does not flash down too quick to follow. It drifts in slow and obvious, telegraphed frame by frame, easily dodged. When you try to slap a bee from the air and miss, you are not too slow. You are simply being watched by an eye, built to make your fastest motion look lazy. If the eyes are strange, the antennae are stranger, because for a bee, smell is not a vague background sense. It is the primary way it knows the world. Those two thin feelers jutting from the bee's face are covered in thousands of microscopic sensory pits, each wired to detect specific molecules drifting in the air. With them, a bee can smell in extraordinary detail, distinguishing flowers, tracking nectar, reading the chemical signature of its own hive, and decoding the flood of pheromones its sisters use to communicate. And because there are two antennae set slightly apart, the bee smells in stereo. Just as your two ears let you locate a sound by the tiny difference in when it reaches each side, the bee's paired antennae let it sense which direction a scent is coming from, to follow a smell through three-dimensional space to its source. It does not just detect the alarm pheromone on a struggling victim. It steers toward it, correcting left and right, homing in on the strongest trace. Up close, under magnification, those antennae are in constant motion, sweeping the air, sampling, adjusting. The bee is reading a landscape we cannot perceive at all, a world drawn entirely in scent, mapped in 3 dimensions, every flower and sister and enemy, a distinct shape made of molecules. The bee does not only read that chemical world, it writes in it. Scattered across a honeybee's body is a whole arsenal of glands, each producing a different scent message, and together they form a language. There is the alarm pheromone from near the sting, the banana-smelling call to attack. There is a gland near the tail that releases a sweet "come here" scent, used to guide lost sisters home or rally a swarm to a new site. The queen produces her own signature chemical that flows through the colony and tells every worker that she is alive and in command. This is how a creature with a brain the size of a sesame seed coordinates the actions of 50,000 others. Not with sound, not with sight. With smell, a constant flowing conversation written in molecules and read off the air. When the killer bee attacks, what looks like chaos is in fact a chemical broadcast. The alarm scent pours out, the rally scent calls more in, and the whole furious cloud is organizing itself in a language we cannot smell and only barely understand. We see an angry swarm. What is actually happening is a colony talking to itself at high volume, every bee both speaking and listening at once. That roar you would hear the sound the swarm makes, it comes from here. A honeybee's wings beat astonishingly fast, somewhere around 230 times every second. The number is so high it breaks the ordinary way muscles work. Your muscles fire once per nerve signal, contracting on command, but no nerve can pulse 200 times a second. So the bee's flight muscles do something different. They are wired to snap back and forth on their own once activated, oscillating like a plucked string far faster than any nerve could drive them directly. That blur of motion is what holds the bee in the air, and it is what we hear. The buzz of a bee is not a voice. It is the wings themselves beating the air more than 200 times a second, and the pitch of that hum rises and falls with how hard the bee is working, which is exactly why the sound of an attacking colony changes. Thousands of bees shifting from a cruising beat to a hard defensive one push their wings faster and the collective pitch climbs. The roar that survivors describe is real physics. The massed wing beat of a colony at full effort, every wing a tiny engine turning over 200 times in the space of a single second. Those same flight muscles do something else remarkable. They make heat, and the bee has learned to use it as both a tool and a weapon. A bee can decouple its wings from its flight muscles and shiver them in place, burning fuel to warm its body without going anywhere. This is how a winter colony survives. The bees cluster into a tight ball and shiver in unison, generating warmth, keeping the heart of the cluster well above freezing even as the world outside turns to ice. They take turns rotating from the cold outer shell to the warm center, and the colony rides out the winter as a single warm-blooded thing made of cold-blooded parts. But the same trick becomes lethal in the right circumstance. When certain honeybees are invaded by a hornet too armored to sting, they do not try to sting it. They swarm over it in a living ball and shiver all of them at once, raising the temperature at the center to a point the hornet cannot survive, but the bees just barely can. They cook the intruder alive with their own body heat. A creature that cannot warm its own blood has found a way to manufacture heat on demand, to survive the cold with it and to kill with it. The same shivering muscle that keeps the winter cluster alive can roast an enemy in its core. Inside the bee is a piece of plumbing that explains the entire economy of the hive. It has in effect two stomachs. The first is not for the bee at all. Called the honey stomach or crop, it is a separate chamber near the front of the gut that works as a tank. When a forager drinks nectar from a flower, most of it goes here, not to be digested, but to be carried. She can fill this tank with close to her own body weight in nectar and fly at home a flying fuel truck hauling a load nearly as heavy as herself. Behind it, guarded by a one-way valve, sits the true stomach, where the bee digests the small share of nectar it keeps to power its own flight. The valve decides what stays for the bee and what is held in trust for the colony. Back at the hive, she brings the honey stomach's cargo back up and passes it mouth to mouth to a waiting sister. That is the foundation of honey nectar, carried in a stomach that was never meant to feed the carrier, handed off and processed by the colony. The bee's own body is built around the principle that runs the whole hive. Most of what it gathers for someone else. The bee carries cargo on the outside too, and the tool for it is built right into its back legs. On the outer surface of each hind leg is a smooth, slightly concave patch fringed with stiff curving hairs. This is the pollen basket. As a bee works a flower, it gets dusted in pollen, and it does not simply let that go to waste. With quick practice strokes, it combs the pollen off its body, mixes it with a little nectar to make it tacky, and packs it into these two baskets, building a dense, brightly colored ball on each leg. You have seen this without knowing it, a bee lifting off from a flower with two fat orange or yellow lumps stuck to its hind legs riding low under the weight. Those lumps are pollen-packed and ready for transport. It is a feat of in-flight loading. The bee grooms itself, packs the cargo, balances the load on both sides, and flies it home, all while visiting flower after flower. The basket holds the pollen tight against the buffeting of flight, then releases it cleanly back at the hive. A purpose-built cargo rack grown right into the leg, one more part of a body engineered down to the last hair, for the single job of gathering. For all these shared marvels of design, there is one place where the killer bee's body differs from the gentle honeybees, and it is subtle enough that you would never spot it. The Africanized bee is slightly smaller, not by much, a fraction of a millimeter, a sliver of weight, but consistently measurably smaller than its European cousin. It is the difference a trained eye and a microscope can catch, and an ordinary glance never will. For decades, the only sure way to tell the two apart was to measure dead bees against a reference, comparing wing veins and body length down to tiny fractions. That smaller size is not cosmetic. A lighter body is a quicker body. The Africanized bee tends to be more agile in the air, faster to launch, faster to swarm. Its compactness, feeding directly into the speed and reactivity that make it so dangerous. It develops faster from egg to adult too, letting its colonies grow and divide more quickly than European ones. So the menace and the marvel turn out to be the same trait seen from two sides. The killer bee is not a bigger, scarier-looking insect. It is, if anything, a slightly smaller one, and the very smallness that makes it nearly impossible to identify by eye is part of what makes it quicker, faster to multiply, and harder to outrun. The bee's body is covered in hair, and that hair does something you would never guess. It carries an electric charge. As a bee flies, friction with the air strips it of electrons, leaving its body with a slight positive charge. Flowers rooted to the ground tend to carry a slight negative one. So when a charged bee approaches a flower, pollen literally leaps the gap, jumping off the bloom and onto the bee's branched, electrostatically charged hairs before it even lands. The bee gathers pollen the way a balloon rubbed on a sweater pulls bits of paper by sheer static attraction. And it goes further. Researchers have found that bees can actually sense these electric fields, using them to tell whether a flower has been recently visited and emptied. A flower's electric signature changes briefly after a bee lands on it, and other bees can read that change, checking in effect whether the table has already been cleared before they bother to sit down. It is a sense we do not have, and can barely imagine a world where flowers carry faint electric halos, where pollen jumps to meet you, where you can feel from a distance whether a blossom is worth the stop. The fuzzy little body is not just gathering pollen, it is reading the static electricity of the meadow. The bee never takes a breath. It has no lungs at all, and the way it does breathe rewrites what you thought the word even meant. Instead of lungs, an insect's body is threaded with a branching network of tiny tubes that open to the outside through small holes along its sides. Air enters through these holes and travels directly through the tubes to every tissue, delivering oxygen straight to the cells without ever passing through blood. The bee does not breathe air into a central organ and pump it around. It lets the air diffuse through pipes into the whole body at once. This is why insects cannot grow to monstrous size, and it is why a bee can run its furious flight muscles at full tilt. The system pipes oxygen right to the muscle where it is burned with no lungs and no bloodstream, slowing the delivery. There is something quietly alien in it. A creature with no chest, no breath, no rise and fall, that takes in air through holes in its flanks and feeds it straight to its flesh through a private network of tubes. Watch a bee at rest and you may see its abdomen pumping faintly, pushing air through the pipes. It is breathing, just not in any sense your own body would recognize. Now hold all of this in mind: the stereo smell, the ultraviolet sight, the chemical language, the navigation, the memory, and consider the organ that runs it. A honeybee's brain is smaller than a single sesame seed. It contains fewer than 1 million nerve cells. Yours holds something close to 86 billion. By raw count, the bee is working with roughly 100,000th of your hardware. And yet that speck of tissue does things that astonish the scientists who study it. It learns. It remembers flowers and roots for days. It does basic arithmetic in laboratory tests, grasps the concept of zero, recognizes patterns and makes decisions weighing multiple competing signals at once. There is no part of that grain-sized brain that can be spared for waste. Every neuron earns its place. This is perhaps the most uncanny fact of all about the bee. We tend to assume intelligence requires bulk, that a bigger brain means a better mind. The bee quietly demolishes the assumption. Packed into less tissue than the seed on a hamburger bun is a flying machine that sees colors we cannot smell in 3 dimensions, speaks a chemical language, navigates by the sun, and remembers where it has been. Whatever intelligence is the bee shows it does not always need much room. Watch a bee fly and you would swear it has 2 wings. It has 4. The trick is in how they joined. A honeybee has 2 pairs of wings, a larger forewing and a smaller hindwing on each side. Flapped separately, they would be clumsy working against each other. So the bee zips them together. Along the leading edge of each hindwing runs a row of tiny hooks, and along the rear edge of each forewing runs a matching fold. In flight, the hooks catch the fold and lock the 2 wings into a single, larger flying surface that beats as one. It is quite literally a zipper, a row of microscopic hooks fastening 2 wings into one, and the bee can unfasten it. At rest, the wings unhook and fold neatly over the body, compact and out of the way. For flight, they zip together into a broad, efficient blade. Under magnification, the hooks are unmistakable. A precise comb of them along the wing's edge, doing the same job as the teeth of a zipper on a jacket. The insect that we picture as crude and simple turns out to carry built into its wings one of the small mechanical inventions we are proud to have thought of ourselves, and it had it first by tens of millions of years. Return finally to the sting, because there is one more strange truth folded into it, and it explains why only some bees can sting at all. The stinger is not an original invention. It is a modified ovipositor, an egg-laying tube. In the distant ancestors of bees and wasps, this organ ran neck to smooth, a structure for placing eggs. Over evolutionary time, in one lineage it was repurposed, the egg guide became a weapon, the tube became a venom-injecting lance. This is why only female bees can sting. The sting is built from the egg-laying machinery, so a male bee, a drone, simply has no stinger at all. He is completely harmless. Every bee that ever stung you, every defender in every furious cloud was female. The worker bees, the daughters of the queen, are all females whose egg-laying organs were converted in the deep past into the spears they now die using. There is a strange poetry in it. The organ that began as an instrument of making life became in the bee an instrument of taking it and of giving up the bearer's own life in the bargain. The same structure that in the queen still lays the eggs that build the colony has become in her sterile daughters the barbed weapon they spend themselves to wield in its defense. The bee finds you by your warmth as much as by your breath and your color. Among the senses packed into those antennae is the ability to detect heat. A warm-blooded animal, a human, a horse, a dog, radiates it constantly, a soft glow of body heat against the cooler background of the world. To a bee tuned to sense it, a person standing in a yard is not just a dark, moving, exhaling shape. It is also a source of warmth marked out from the cool air and ground around it. In an attack, this becomes one more channel guiding the swarm in. Carbon dioxide marks where you breathe. Dark color and motion mark where you are. Heat marks the living, blooded surface of you, and the warmest, most exposed part is again the head and face. The senses stack, every one of them converging on the same target. It is part of why there is almost no hiding from a committed colony in the open. You can hold still to defeat the motion sense, hold your breath to dampen the carbon dioxide trail, but you cannot turn off your own warmth. The body glows with it, and the bee with that grain-sized brain and those sweeping antennae reads the glow as easily as it reads everything else and steers in. The bee wears its skeleton on the outside, and that simple fact shapes everything about how it lives and how it dies. A bee has no bones. Its body is held up and held in by an exoskeleton, a shell of tough, lightweight material called chitin that serves at once as skin armor and frame. Muscles anchor to its inner surface. It keeps the soft insides in and the dry world out, sealing the bee against losing the water it cannot spare. For its weight, it is remarkably strong, letting a creature this small haul heavy loads of nectar and pollen and survive knocks that would matter to a soft-bodied thing. But the shell has limits, and they are the bee's undoing. It does not stretch or grow, which is why insects must develop inside fixed stages, rather than swelling gradually. It offers little against the cold. The bee cannot armor itself against freezing, and against the simplest pressures it is fragile. A swat, a clap, a footstep ends a bee instantly, cracking the shell that protects it from everything except brute force. This is the paradox of the individual killer bee. Armored enough to fly heavy and live hard, it is still crushed between two fingers without effort. The colony's terrible strength was never in any single body. Each one is a delicate machine in a thin shell. The power is only ever in how many of them there are. So bring the camera in close, closer than the eye ever gets to look and hold on one bee. Start at the head. Two great compound eyes, each a mosaic of thousands of lenses, seeing ultraviolet, catching motion we cannot. Between them, two antennae in restless motion, reading the air in stereo, tasting scent and heat and the electric charge of the world. Below the mouth parts, a long tongue for nectar, jaws for building and grooming. Move back to the thorax, the engine room packed solid with the flight muscles that snap the four hooked-together wings more than 200 times a second, and that can shiver in place to make heat enough to kill. The legs hang below each pair, specialized, the hind ones carrying their baskets for pollen. Then the abdomen striped and segmented, breathing through holes along its sides with no lung anywhere inside it. The two stomachs, one for the self and one for the colony. And at the very tip, sheathed and waiting, the barbed sting, a converted egg layer, a one-use suicide weapon, with its own pulsing pump and its own scrap of nerve. All of it runs on a brain smaller than a sesame seed. Every piece optimized, nothing wasted, a body refined over 100 million years into a single flying instrument. Hold the close-up a moment longer. This is the thing that lives by the thousands in the wall, and the next stage of the story is not what it is, but what together all of them can do. Here is the shift that changes everything. You have been watching one bee. Stop. The bee was never the animal. The real organism is the colony. A single honeybee alone is barely a complete creature. It cannot reproduce, cannot survive a cold night by itself, cannot do much of anything that lasts. But put 50,000 of them together, and something appears that none of them possesses alone a mind. Not in any one bee's head. Spread across all of them at once. Biologists call it a superorganism, and they mean it almost literally. The colony regulates its own temperature like a warm-blooded body. It makes decisions, defends itself, allocates labor, and pursues goals, all without a leader, without a plan, without any single bee understanding what the whole is doing. The queen does not command it. She lays eggs. The intelligence is in the network, in the ceaseless exchange of food and scent and vibration between thousands of simple parts. This is the lens for everything that follows. When the killer colony hunts a threat, navigates, votes on a home, or cools itself in summer, no bee is in charge of the feat. The cleverness lives between them in the connections, a single mind with 50,000 bodies thinking thoughts that no one of them could hold. A bee finds a field of flowers half a mile away. How does she tell the others where she dances it? Back at the hive, on the vertical face of the comb in total darkness, the returning forager runs a strange looping figure, a straight march while shaking her body side to side, then a circle back, then the waggle again, over and over. And packed into that little dance is a map. The angle of her waggle relative to straight up encodes the direction of the flowers relative to the sun. The length of the waggle encodes how far away they are. The longer she shakes, the farther her sisters must fly. This is one of the only known cases in all of nature of an animal giving another animal abstract symbolic directions, a true language of movement decoded by the scientist who cracked it and earned a Nobel Prize for the work. A bee that has never seen the flowers can watch the dance, read the angle and the duration, and fly straight out to a meadow she was told about in the dark. Her watching sisters cannot see her in that blackness. They feel her pressing close, reading the vibration and the motion with their antennae. A blind dance in the dark, translating the angle of the sun into the steps of a jig and back again into a heading across open country. The grain-sized brain is doing geometry and teaching it to others. When a colony outgrows its home and a swarm sets out to find a new one, it faces a genuine problem with no manager to solve it. Thousands of bees must agree on a single nest site, and agree completely because the colony cannot split its vote and survive. So they hold an election. Scout bees fly out and inspect possible homes, a hollow tree, a gap in a wall, a cavity in the rocks. Each scout that finds a promising site returns and dances for it, and the better the site, the longer and more vigorously she dances. Other scouts go and check the advertised spots for themselves, and if they agree, they come back and dance for it too, adding their voices. Gradually the dancing tips. A mediocre site draws a few unenthusiastic dancers that fade. A superb site draws more and more dancers, each recruiting others until the support snowballs. The scouts, even actively quiet rivals, head-butting bees dancing for competing sites, damping down the alternatives. When enough scouts are committed to one place, a threshold tips, and the whole swarm lifts off and flies to the winner. It is democracy run by insects, and it works astonishingly well, choosing by these means the best available home most of the time. No bee tallies the votes. No bee decides. The decision emerges from the dancing, the checking, the cross-inhibition, until the colony as one has simply made up its mind. Inside the nest, the brood, the developing young, must be kept warm and stable, and the colony holds the temperature with a precision that would impress an engineer. The heart of the brood nest is maintained at around 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and the bees keep it there within a degree or two no matter what the weather does outside. When the nest grows cold, bees cluster over the brood and shiver, their flight muscles generating heat with their bodies until the temperature climbs back. When it grows too hot, they switch to cooling, fanning their wings at the entrance to drive air through, and even carrying in water and spreading it in thin films to be fanned away, an evaporative cooling system run on wings and droplets. So a wild colony in a desert wall holds its core at blood heat, through a 100-degree afternoon and a near-freezing night, steady as a thermostat, without one bee knowing the target number. The control matters more than comfort. Brood raised even slightly too cool or too warm develops wrong bees that emerge with subtle defects in learning and behavior. So the colony guards those few degrees fiercely, thousands of bees shivering and fanning and ferrying water in shifts, holding the cradle of the next generation at exactly the temperature life requires. Now, layer the killer bee's particular genius back onto this superorganism, because its differences are not only about temper, they are about pace. The Africanized colony swarms far more often than a European one. Swarming is how a colony reproduces itself. The old hive raises a new queen, and the existing queen leaves, with a large share of the workers to found a second colony elsewhere. A European colony might do this once a year in good conditions. An Africanized colony does it again and again, splitting and resplitting, whenever it has the numbers, throwing off swarm after swarm through the warm season. The arithmetic is relentless. One colony becomes two, two become four, each new colony growing fast on the Africanized bee's quick development, and then dividing again. This is the engine behind the famous spread, not bees flying north in a single great migration, but colonies budding and budding, the population doubling its way across a continent. It also explains why they turn up where no one wants them. A colony that swarms this readily is constantly sending out new swarms looking for homes, and those swarms are not picky. A meter box, an overturned bucket, a cavity in a playground wall, anywhere a European bee would swarm once a year. The Africanized bee is producing the restless house-hunting swarms many times over, seeding the landscape with new colonies faster than anyone can find them. There is a second behavior rarer in European bees and common in killer bees that is stranger than swarming, and it shows just how differently this colony weighs its options. It is called absconding. Swarming is reproduction, the colony divides and both halves go on. Absconding is abandonment. The entire colony queen workers, all of it, simply walks away from the nest, leaving behind the comb, the stores, sometimes even the developing brood, and flies off to start over somewhere new. European bees almost never do this. They are invested in their home and defend it to the end. If conditions sour too little, food too much disturbance, a predator that keeps coming back, the colony does not dig in. It cuts its losses and leaves, sacrificing the work it has done for a fresh start elsewhere. It is a profoundly different survival strategy, and it makes the killer bee maddeningly hard to control. Disturb a European colony, and it stays and can be managed. Disturb an Africanized one, and it may vanish overnight, the whole living mass gone by morning, reassembled in a new cavity miles away. The colony behaves less like a building rooted to a spot and more like a nomad willing, at any time, to abandon everything it has built and carry its single distributed mind off to begin again. Return to those house-hunting scouts, because what a single scout does when she inspects a possible home is a marvel of judgment in a body that small. A scout arriving at a candidate cavity does not give it a glance. She inspects it. She walks the inside, measuring. She assesses the volume of the space too small, and the colony will outgrow it too large, and it cannot be kept warm. She checks the size of the entrance, whether it can be defended, which direction it faces, how high off the ground it sits, whether the space is dry. She flies around the outside and walks the inside, sometimes for half an hour, gathering all of it. Then she renders a verdict. She integrates these separate measurements, size, entrance, height, dryness, exposure, into a single judgment of quality, and that judgment sets how hard she will dance for the place when she returns. A near-perfect cavity earns a long, passionate dance. A flawed one earns a brief, half-hearted shuffle that recruits no one. Think about what that requires. A bee weighing volume against entrance, size against height, against dryness, combining incommensurable measurements into one decision, then expressing that decision as the intensity of a dance, all in a grain-sized brain. She is a building inspector, an appraiser, and a campaigner in one. And the quality of the colony's eventual home rests on how honestly and accurately each scout does her solitary work. Within the hive, the work gets done without anyone assigning it, and the way labor is divided is one of the colony's quiet wonders. A worker bee does not have one job. She has a career. She moves through a sequence of roles as she ages. In her first days newly emerged, she cleans cells, scrubbing out the cradles for the next eggs. A little older, she becomes a nurse, feeding the larvae from glands in her own head. Older still, she takes on building, drawing out wax comb, then storing and ripening nectar, then guarding the entrance against intruders. Only in the last phase of her life, her body now mature and somewhat expendable, does she leave the hive at all and become a forager, flying out for nectar and pollen until she wears out and dies. The progression tracks her body's changes. The glands that make brood food swell and then shrink the wax. Glands wax and wane so that her physiology and her job stay matched. And it is flexible. If the colony loses all its foragers, some nurses will accelerate and become foragers early. If it needs more nurses, foragers can sometimes revert. No one directs this. There is no schedule, no foreman. Each bee reads her own internal state and the needs around her, and shifts her labor accordingly. And out of thousands of these private decisions emerges a workforce always roughly matched to the colony's needs, a self-organizing bee economy, with no economist, every worker living out the same arc, from nursery to the open sky. Now bring that organization to the killer bee's signature act, the defense, because what looks like a mindless mob is in fact a coordinated, layered operation. It begins at the gate. Guard bees stationed at the entrance are the first line screening every arrival, challenging anything that does not smell like the colony. When a real threat appears, these guards do not just attack. They raise the alarm, releasing the banana-scented pheromone that summons the next layer. The signal radiates inward, and a reserve of defenders, bees primed and ready inside, pours out to meet the threat. Behind them, if the disturbance is severe, the colony commits still more, wave after wave, scaling its response to the size of the provocation. The Africanized colony runs this same program, but with the thresholds turned savagely low and the numbers turned high. A small disturbance that a European hive would meet with a few guards triggers in the killer colony a full mobilization, the layers collapsing into one massive immediate surge. But it is still organized. The alarm scent marks the target. The rally scent calls reinforcements. The pursuit follows the heat and breath and motion. Each bee runs a simple rule, and the rules interlock into something that behaves like strategy. The cloud chasing a victim across a field is not chaos. It is a defensive system executing every bee a component, the whole far more coordinated than its furious appearance suggests. A colony does not just react to a threat in the moment, it can learn one and remember it. Honeybees have been shown in experiment after experiment to learn and recall. They associate scents and colors with reward, remember productive flowers for days, and recognize the layout of landmarks around home. And that learning extends to danger. A colony that has been disturbed once is primed quicker to respond, more easily set off for hours and even days afterward, as if the memory of the attack lingers in the nest's collective mood. There is evidence that bees can even learn to recognize specific recurring threats, tuning their response to a particular predator or disturbance that keeps returning. The colony that was raided yesterday is not the same colony today. It is warier, faster, harder to approach. For the Africanized bee, this turns a single encounter into a standing hazard. A colony provoked in the morning by a passing mower, a curious dog, a thrown stone can stay on a hair trigger all afternoon, attacking a second wholly innocent passerby, far more fiercely than it would have at dawn. The hive holds a grudge in the only way a hive can, a chemical, collective memory of having been attacked, written across thousands of primed and waiting bodies. How does a colony remember without a brain to hold the memory? When the colony is disturbed, the alarm pheromone does not simply flash and vanish. It lingers, clinging to the comb, to the bees themselves, keeping the whole population in a heightened state long after the trigger is gone. A bee that never saw the original threat still smells the alarm and inherits the agitation. The mood spreads and holds, a shared chemical state that no single bee created or controls. And there is a deeper layer. The constant exchange of food and fluids between bees mouth to mouth, all day long, circulates chemical information through the colony, including the queen's signals and others that shape behavior. Information moves through the superorganism, the way molecules move through a body carried in shared fluid, touching every member. So the colony's memory of a threat is not stored anywhere you could point to. It is distributed, held in the lingering scent on the comb, in the primed state of thousands of bees, in the chemical traffic flowing between them. The hive remembers the way a crowd holds a mood, not in any one head, but in the signals passing constantly between all of them, keeping the alarm alive long after its cause has gone. A forager flies out a mile from home, wanders a field flower to flower, and then flies a straight line back to a hole in a wall she cannot see. The navigation behind that is breathtaking, and it begins with the sun. The bee uses the sun as a compass, but the sun moves across the sky through the day, so a fixed bearing on it would steadily mislead, and the bee corrects for this, accounting for the sun's motion to keep her headings true even as it travels. Her internal clock tells her where the sun should be, and she reads her direction against it. And when clouds hide the sun, she is not lost. The bee can read the pattern of polarized light in the blue sky, a pattern invisible to us but woven across the whole dome of the sky by the way sunlight scatters in the atmosphere. From a single patch of blue between clouds, she can reconstruct where the hidden sun must be and steer by it. So the bee navigates by a sky we cannot fully see, reading polarization. We have no sense for correcting for the sun's drift. With a built-in clock holding a true course across open country, she combines this celestial compass with a memory of landmarks and a running sense of how far she has flown, and assembles from all of it a reliable way home, a grain of a brain doing celestial navigation every trip without a single instrument but its own eyes and sense of time. That correction for the sun's motion deserves a closer look, because it reveals something almost unsettling about what the bee carries inside her, a clock and an awareness of time itself. Here is the problem. A bee dances to tell her sisters the direction to a flower patch, encoding it as an angle relative to the sun. But the sun moves. A bee who scouted a patch in the morning when the sun was in the east might keep dancing about it for hours. And if she danced the same angle by afternoon with the sun in the west, that angle would point her sisters the wrong way entirely. She does not make that mistake. As the hours pass, a dancing bee slowly rotates the angle of her dance to keep pace with the moving sun, so that her directions stay true through the day. She is compensating in the dark of the hive, where she cannot even see the sun, for exactly how far it has traveled since she last looked. That means she is tracking time and translating it into geometry, adjusting a learned angle by the sun's known rate of travel continuously from memory. A creature with a brain smaller than a sesame seed runs an internal clock, accurate enough to keep its celestial navigation honest across a long summer day. It does not just know direction, it knows that the heavens move at what rate, and how to bend its own dance to match. A colony is 50,000 bodies packed warm and close in the dark, a perfect breeding ground for disease. That the colony survives at all owes much to a behavior that amounts to public health carried out by the bees themselves. It is called hygienic behavior. Certain workers patrol the broodcomb, and they can detect through the wax cappings which developing larvae have fallen sick or been infested by parasites. Having found a diseased cell, they uncap it and drag the infected larva out, removing it from the nest before the illness can spread. They are, in effect, an immune system made of individuals sensing infection, isolating it, and discarding it to protect the whole. The trait varies between colonies, and the ones that do it well are markedly more resistant to the diseases and parasites that devastate honeybees. Beekeepers prize and breed for it, because a hygienic colony defends its own health far better than a careless one. There is something moving in the picture. The colony has no doctors, no understanding of germs, no notion of disease at all. And yet it acts through these patrolling workers exactly as a body acts against infection, detecting the sick cell, removing it, sacrificing the few to save the many, a self-organizing immune system spread across thousands of bees, keeping the superorganism alive against the constant pressure of the things that would rot it from within. We touched this in passing as a feat of the body. Seen as a feat of the colony, it is one of the most astonishing acts of coordinated behavior in the insect world, a defense by cooking. When a hornet, a predator far too armored for a bee's sting to pierce, invades the nest, certain honeybees do not waste themselves stinging it. Instead, dozens of them mob the intruder at once, swarming over it in a tight ball with the hornet trapped at the center. And then together they shiver. All of them in unison run their flight muscles to generate heat, raising the temperature inside the ball. The bees have evolved to tolerate heat just slightly higher than the hornet can survive. So as the ball's core climbs, the trapped hornet cooks while the bees endure the intruder pushed just past its limit, the bees holding just within theirs. They have measured in evolutionary time the exact thermal margin between predator and prey, and they exploit it precisely. It is a weapon that no single bee possesses. One bee shivering does nothing to a hornet. Only the colony dozens acting as one furnace can raise the killing heat, and only because each bee runs the same simple program of clustering and shivering, the lethal result emerging from their union. A single distributed mind defending itself with a fever it generates on demand, cooking its enemy alive inside a living ball. A colony's most consequential decision is when to make a new queen, and the way it senses the need and acts on it shows the superorganism managing its own future. Normally, one chemical fact holds the colony together. The reigning queen constantly emits a pheromone, her signature scent, that flows through the hive and tells every worker she is present and laying. As long as that signal is strong, the colony raises no rivals. But the signal can weaken or vanish if the queen ages, falters, or dies, and the workers detect the absence within hours. Sensing the gap, they spring into action, selecting a few ordinary young larvae and beginning to raise them as queens. The colony also reads its own prosperity. When it grows crowded and rich, the queen's signal effectively thins across too many bodies, and this scarcity helps trigger the colony to raise new queens for swarming to reproduce by division. The decision to make a queen is thus tuned to two different futures: replacement, when the old queen fails, and reproduction, when the colony is ready to split. No bee oversees this. The workers read the concentration of a scent, sense crowding and resources, and respond with one of the most irreversible acts a colony can take. From a falling chemical signal and a feeling of crowding, the superorganism decides collectively that the time has come to crown a successor, and begins in a few chosen cells to build the colony's next reign. Among all the silent chemistry, the colony does make one sound charged with meaning, and it comes from the queen herself. It is called piping. When a new queen is developing, a colony may end up with more than one rival queen about to emerge, and only one can rule. A young queen free in the hive produces a strange, eerie sound, a thin, pulsing tone made by pressing her thorax to the comb and running her flight muscles so the whole comb vibrates and broadcasts it. Beekeepers who have heard it describe a high, almost otherworldly piping rising from inside the hive. It is communication and possibly challenge. One interpretation holds that a freed queen pipes to announce herself, and that rival queens still sealed in their cells answer with a muffled piping of their own, the two signaling across the comb. The sounds may help the queens locate one another for the duel that decides the succession, or help the workers manage the dangerous interval when more than one queen exists. So, in a colony that speaks almost entirely in scent and vibration, the single most dramatic moment, the contest for the throne, is marked by actual sound. A queen drumming her challenge into the comb for the whole hive to feel. It is the closest thing the colony has to a voice, and it is reserved for the rarest and most fateful of its events, the question of who will reign. That piping points to a whole channel of communication. We have only begun to appreciate the colony talks not just in scent and dance, but in vibration carried through the comb itself. The wax comb is more than storage and cradle. It is a medium, a great shared membrane that transmits the tiny tremors bees make, letting signals travel through the structure to be felt by bees touching it elsewhere. The waggle dance itself relies partly on this, the dancer's vibrations passing through the comb to the sisters pressed around her in the dark. And there are other signals. A brief vibrational pulse one bee delivers to another that seems to modulate activity, nudging the recipient toward or away from work. So the comb is something like a telephone line strung through the colony, carrying mechanical messages between bees that never see one another. A creature touching the wax is plugged into a network of vibration, sensing the dances and signals rippling through it from all directions. We tend to imagine the hive's coordination as purely chemical clouds of scent, but layered beneath the chemistry is this physical conversation, bees drumming and pulsing through the wax, the whole comb alive with transmitted signal. The superorganism's nervous system, it turns out, is partly built of the very structure it lives in, messages running through the wax like impulses through tissue, binding thousands of separate bodies into one responsive whole. Pull these threads of intelligence together and aim them at the killer bee's defining trait, and a question sharpens: is the Africanized bee's ferocity partly a matter of how it learns? The bee's aggression is rooted in genetics, the African heritage that lowered every threshold for defense. But aggression is not only a fixed reflex, it interacts with the colony's capacity to learn and become primed. An Africanized colony appears not just more reactive in the instant, but quicker to enter and longer to hold the agitated primed state that follows a disturbance. Its low thresholds mean it learns the lesson of threat faster and forgets it slower, staying dangerous well after the cause has passed. Researchers studying the genetics of honeybee behavior have traced defensive temperament to specific patterns in the genes and found that the African and European lineages differ in exactly the directions you would expect. The African genes pushing toward faster, stronger, more persistent response. The temperament is heritable, written in the lineage, expressed in how readily the colony's collective mood tips toward war. So the killer bee's danger is not only that it stings more, it is that its very capacity to register a threat and stay alarmed is tuned higher. A colony genetically biased to take alarm, quickly commit fully, and remain on guard. The intelligence that lets any colony learn and remember a danger is in this lineage set to a hair trigger, making the hive not just fiercer, but, in its own collective way, warier and harder to talk down. Step back from the menace for a moment and consider the colony purely as an economy, because the way it organizes its foraging is a feat of optimization that human industries study and envy. A colony has thousands of foragers and a whole landscape of flowers, some patches rich, some poor, some near, some far, all changing through the day as blooms open and empty. The colony must constantly steer its workforce toward the best available returns, and it does without any manager doing the sums. The recruitment dance is the mechanism. A forager who finds a rich, close patch dances long and hard, recruiting many sisters to it. A poorer or more distant find earns a feebler dance and draws fewer. The richest sources pull the most labor automatically, and the system tracks change. As a good patch is exhausted, the dancing for it wanes and recruitment shifts elsewhere. As a new bloom opens, the bees that find it ramp up their dancing and draw the workforce over. The colony continuously reallocates its foragers toward the current best returns, a living market adjusting in real time. Engineers have actually borrowed this. The logic by which bees balance their workforce across changing options has been turned into algorithms for distributing tasks across computer servers and networks. Human systems learning to allocate resources by imitating the hive. The colony with no economist and no plan solves a hard optimization problem every single day, steering thousands of workers toward the best return through nothing but the honesty of the dance. Lift the camera now. Rise above the field and watch a swarm in flight, because from this height, the truth of the superorganism becomes something you can see. A swarm on the move is tens of thousands of bees flying as one body. From above it reads not as a scatter of insects, but as a single dark form, a shifting cloud that holds together, flows around obstacles, and travels with clear purpose across the landscape. Inside it, the queen is carried along in the throng. Ahead and through it, the scouts that chose the destination steer the mass, streaking through the cloud in the agreed direction, guiding the whole by their example, until the swarm pours itself into its new home. There is no leader visible, no formation, no command, and yet the cloud moves like an animal, coherent, directed, alive, a single thing made of thousands of beating wings holding its shape across open country. This is the image to hold from the whole stage. Everything you have seen, the voting, the dancing, the shared memory, the navigation, the coordinated defense, collapses from this height into one moving form. The colony was never the bees. It was this, a body without a skeleton, a mind without a head, a single organism wearing 50,000 wings crossing the field below as one. And the next questions are the oldest ones, where such a thing comes from, how it makes more of itself, and how from a handful of imported queens it came to fill 2 continents. Before we leave the colony's mind, an honest pause, because the language of voting and deciding and remembering raises a real question, and scientists genuinely disagree about how far to push it. When the colony chooses a home or commits to a defense, is it deciding in any sense worth the word? Or is it only the sum of thousands of bees each, following blind rules, with the appearance of choice emerging by accident. Researchers still debate where the line falls. Some are cautious, insisting that nothing in the hive truly decides that decision is just a convenient label for mechanical aggregation, and that talk of a hive mind risks dressing up simple chemistry as something grander. Others point out that the colony's choosing has striking parallels to how decisions emerge in a brain where no single neuron decides either, and that if we grant the word to brains, we have little ground to deny it to hives. The disagreement is not really about the bees. It is about what we mean by deciding, by knowing, by mind, and the colony sits exactly on the boundary where those words start to blur. What is not in dispute is the achievement. Whatever we call it, 50,000 bees with no leader settle on the best home, hold their core at blood heat, allocate their labor, and defend themselves with layered precision. Maybe that is decision, and maybe it is only its perfect imitation, but from the outside across the whole sweep of what the colony does, the difference grows genuinely hard to find. The hive does not need us to agree on the word. It simply somehow makes up its mind. Inside one colony live two utterly different lifespans, and the gap between them is one of the strangest facts in all of biology. The same animal born from the same kind of egg lives either a few short weeks or several long years, and which fate she gets is decided not by her genes but by what she was fed as a baby. A worker bee in the busy summer lives perhaps 5 or 6 weeks. She wears herself out nursing, building, foraging, until her wings fray and her body fails, and she dies far from home in a field mid-flight. Brief, spent, replaceable. The queen, her genetic equal, can live 4 or 5 years. While her daughters burn through their weeks by the thousands, she goes on and on, season after season, the still center of the turning colony. That a single species contains both lives at once, the mayfly worker and the long-reigning queen divided by nothing but childhood diet, is a wonder that never quite loses its strangeness. 2 destinies, 1 genome. The difference between a life measured in weeks and a life measured in years was for each of them decided in the cradle before they had done a single thing. A queen who will lay every egg in the colony for years to come gets exactly 1 chance early in her life to gather the sperm she will need, and what she does with that 1 flight is astonishing. A few days after she emerges, the virgin queen leaves the hive on her mating flight, climbing into the air to a place where male bees gather. There in flight she mates not with 1 male but with many, often a dozen or more, one after another in a single afternoon. Then she returns home, and she never mates again. Everything those males gave her she stores. Inside her body is a special organ, a tiny vessel that holds the collected sperm. Millions of cells kept alive and viable inside her for the rest of her years. From this single store she fertilizes egg after egg, day after day, for the entire span of her reign. Consider the economy of it. 1 flight on 1 afternoon of her youth must supply every fertilized egg of a 4-year reign. Hundreds of thousands of bees. An entire dynasty, all drawn from sperm, gathered in a single hour and kept alive in her body for years. She spends the rest of her long life laying out the consequences of 1 brief flight into the open sky. That stored sperm feeds an output that is hard to believe even when you do the arithmetic. At the height of the season, a honeybee queen lays as many as 1,500 to 2,000 eggs in a single day. Picture the pace. 2,000 eggs a day is well over 1 egg every minute around the clock without pause. A steady, ceaseless production that goes on day after day through the warm months. Lay her output end to end, and in a single day she has produced a mass of eggs that altogether can weigh as much as the queen herself. She does almost nothing else. Worker bees clean the cells ahead of her and feed her constantly to fuel the effort. She moves across the comb, inspecting each cell, lowering her abdomen, placing 1 egg, moving to the next, hour upon hour. She is less an individual than an organ, the colony's reproductive engine running flat out. Over a single good season, those daily thousands accumulate into a staggering total, the foundation of everything the colony is. Every forager in the field, every guard at the gate, every bee in the furious defensive cloud began, as one egg placed by her, one a minute, in the endless patient round of a queen who does little in her long life, but make more life faster than seems possible. Return to that fork between the weeks-long worker and the years-long queen, because the mechanism behind it is one of biology's most remarkable switches, and it runs entirely on food. When a colony needs a new queen, the workers choose a few ordinary female larvae that left alone would have become workers like any other. There is nothing special about them. The difference is made entirely in how they are fed. These chosen larvae are flooded with a substance called royal jelly, a rich secretion from the heads of nurse bees, and they are fed it lavishly continuously, far beyond what an ordinary larva receives. That diet rewrites their development. Bathed in royal jelly, the larva's body takes a completely different path, growing larger, maturing into a fully fertile queen with functioning ovaries primed for her years-long reproductive reign. The same larva fed an ordinary diet would have become a sterile worker dead in 6 weeks. It is a transformation worked by nutrition alone. No change in the genes. The queen and the worker can be genetically identical. The entire difference between a 6-week life and a 5-year reign, between sterility and the founding of a dynasty, is written by what the nurse bees pour into the cell. The colony makes its queen the way it makes everything, by deciding, in this case through food, what an ordinary life will be allowed to become. Among the tens of thousands of females in a colony lives a population of males, the drones, and their existence is a study in single-minded biological purpose, with an ending to match. A drone does almost nothing that we would call work. He does not forage, does not build, does not nurse, does not defend. He has no stinger to defend with. He is larger than a worker, with enormous eyes for spotting a queen in flight, and he is built and maintained by the colony for one function alone: to mate. The workers feed him and tend him through the season for the chance, slim for any individual drone, that he might be one of the few to mate with a virgin queen on her flight. And for the drone that succeeds, mating is fatal. The act of mating kills him. He dies in the moment of his single purpose falling away spent. The very few that achieve what they exist for do not survive it. The rest fare little better. As the season turns toward autumn, and the colony tightens its economy for winter, the now useless drones become a cost it will not pay. The workers stop feeding them, drag them to the entrance, and force them out to die in the cold. A whole caste built for one act, most never performing it, the successful ones killed by it, and the remainder expelled when the season for them ends. The drone's life is purpose distilled to a single point, and nothing held in reserve beyond it. We have called swarming the colony's way of reproducing. Watch it happen, and it becomes one of the most dramatic events in nature, a single organism dividing itself in two in mid-air before your eyes. When a colony grows strong and crowded, it prepares to split. It raises new queens, and then on the chosen day, the old queen leaves, and with her pours out a huge share of the workers, often half the colony, in a sudden roaring exodus from the entrance. The air fills with bees in their thousands, a great spiraling cloud, until they gather and settle, usually on a nearby branch, into a hanging cluster around their queen. That cluster is a colony between homes, the living half of an organism that has just divided. From it the scouts fly out to find a new nest, and once they have chosen, the whole mass lifts off and moves to its new home. Back in the old hive, a new queen emerges to rule the half that stayed. One colony has become two. This is reproduction at the level of the superorganism. The individual that divides is not a bee, but the colony itself, splitting its body of thousands into two living wholes, each with a queen, each able to grow and divide again. The killer bee, doing this far more often than its gentle cousin, turns the wonder into an engine, a single colony budding and budding across a season. Each new swarm a fresh organism cast out to fill the land. Run that engine across a map and a continent, and you get one of the fastest and most consequential biological invasions ever recorded, a spread you can measure in miles per year. It began in Brazil in the late 1950s, with the accidental release we will come to. From that single starting point in the south of the continent, the Africanized bees pushed outward in every favorable direction, and the pace was relentless. Year after year, the leading edge of their range advanced roughly 200 to 300 miles, a front of budding, swarming colonies rolling across the landscape faster than anything had any way to stop. In a little over 3 decades, that front crossed an entire hemisphere, out of Brazil, up through the South American tropics, across the narrow bridge of Central America, through the whole length of Mexico, and at last in 1990, across the southern border of the United States into Texas. Thousands of miles conquered in a single human generation. Lay the dates on the map, and the regularity is eerie, the range expanding like a stain year by year, each season's front a measurable distance beyond the last. No army moved that predictably. It was not a migration and not a plan. It was the simple arithmetic of swarming compounded across a continent, each colony making more colonies. The whole population doubling its way north at the speed of bees, looking for homes, until the wave that started in one Brazilian apiary broke at last on the United States. That advancing front did not slow when it reached the United States. It kept rolling, and watching where it went and where it finally faltered reveals the one thing that has any power over these bees: the cold. From Texas through the 1990s and beyond, the Africanized bees fanned outward across the warm southern tier of the country into New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, the southern reaches of California, and across to Florida. Through this favorable, warm country they continued their steady march, the same budding and swarming advance that had carried them out of Brazil, claiming new territory season after season. But as the front pushed northward, it began for the first time to slow. The bees that had crossed thousands of tropical and subtropical miles without check ran into something: they could not simply swarm past winter. The colder northern climate is hard on a lineage shaped by the African tropics. Africanized colonies, quicker to abscond and less prone to stockpiling deep winter stores, struggle to survive long, hard cold, and somewhere in the temperate middle of the country the relentless front finally stalled. So the spread that crossed a hemisphere met its limit not in any human effort but in latitude, in the simple fact of frost. The map of the killer bee in North America is in the end a map of warmth filling the hot south, completely thinning and faltering as it climbs toward the cold. The cold did what no barrier, no border, no program of control ever managed. It drew the line the bees could not cross. Behind every one of those advancing millions lies a private miracle repeated in the dark of the comb, hundreds of thousands of times, the making of a single bee from a single egg sealed away inside a wax cell. It begins with the egg the queen places at the bottom of a cell, tiny, pale, no bigger than a comma. In a few days it hatches into a larva, a small white grub with no legs, no wings, no eyes, that does nothing but eat. The nurse bees feed it, and it swells, shedding its skin to grow, filling its cell. Then the workers cap the cell over with wax, sealing the larva inside in darkness, and within that sealed chamber, the real transformation begins. The larva spins itself a cocoon and becomes a pupa, and inside that stillness its body is taken apart and rebuilt. The legless grub dissolves much of what it was, and reorganizes into something wholly different: eyes forming wings, forming legs and antennae, and the striped adult body taking shape from the remade material of the larva. Complete metamorphosis, not a growing up, but a near total reconstruction. And then the wax cap breaks from within, and a finished adult bee chews her way out into the light of the hive, a fully formed creature with eyes and wings and instincts where days before there was only a featureless grub. Every bee in the colony, every forager and guard and queen passed through this sealed cell transformation, dismantled and rebuilt in the dark. The colony's millions are all, each one, the product of this quiet, hidden remaking of one body into another. Multiply that hidden miracle by the queen's relentless output across the years of a colony's life, and the totals climb into figures that strain the imagination. A strong queen laying well over 1,000 eggs a day, sustained across the warm months, produces somewhere on the order of 150 to 200,000 bees in a single year. And a colony does not live a single year. A well-established colony queen, succeeding queen, can persist and produce for years on end, meaning that across the full life of one ongoing colony, the number of bees born and spent runs into the millions. Think of what that means for one hole in one wall. The quiet colony in the shed, the one the man with the lawnmower never knew was there over its life. It may have produced and burned through 1,000,000 bodies or more, generation after generation, hatching from the comb, living there few weeks, and dying replaced before they were cold by the next from the queen's endless laying. The colony endures precisely because the individual does not. It is a fountain of disposable lives, each bee a brief flicker, the whole sustained by the sheer rate of replacement. 1,000,000 lives or more poured through a single nest, and every one of them, egg to grub to sealed cell to flight, the product of the same patient transformation repeated until the numbers stop meaning anything at all. Return to that moment in the swarm's life when it is most vulnerable and most wondrous, the days when it is a colony with no home at all, hanging exposed in the open air and surviving anyway. When a swarm leaves the old hive, it does not fly straight to a new one. It settles often on a tree branch into a dense hanging cluster, thousands of bees gripping one another layer upon layer, forming a living mass the size and shape of a hanging fruit, with the queen sheltered safe in the middle. And there it stays, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, while the scouts search and the colony decides where to go. With no nest, no comb, no shelter, the cluster protects itself with its own bodies. The bees on the outside form a living skin, packed tight against the weather, while those within keep the queen and the core warm by their shared heat, shivering when needed, fanning when too hot. The cluster is a colony reduced to nothing but itself, no walls, no stores, just thousands of bees holding together against the open world. There is something quietly astonishing in the sight, a whole colony exposed on a branch with no home and no defenses, but its own massed flesh holding its shape and its warmth, and its queen through wind and night waiting. It is the superorganism, at its most stripped down, and its most clearly alive, a single body of thousands homeless hanging in the air, keeping itself together by the simple act of every bee holding on. When the swarm finds its home and begins to build, it constructs something that has fascinated mathematicians for 2,000 years. Comb. Without knowing it, the bees build their comb from wax their own bodies produce, secreted in tiny flakes from glands on their abdomens and worked warm in their jaws. And they build it in hexagons, six-sided cells packed side by side in that endlessly repeating honeycomb pattern. It is not an arbitrary choice. Of all the shapes that tile a surface without gaps, the hexagon encloses the most space using the least material. Squares waste volume, circles leave gaps. The hexagon is the optimal solution, the most storage for the least wax. Mathematicians long suspected this, and only relatively recently proved it rigorously that the hexagonal grid is the most efficient way to divide a plane into equal cells. The bees arrived at the answer first by tens of millions of years, building the proven optimal structure with no geometry but instinct. Stand close to fresh comb, and the precision is uncanny, cell after cell, of near-identical hexagons, walls shared between neighbors, the whole sheet, a model of economy. The bees are not measuring angles or calculating areas. Each works on her own patch, by feel and instinct, and out of their separate labor emerges this flawless, efficient lattice, the colony building in wax. The very shape that human mathematics would later struggle to prove was best all along. The colony fills those perfect cells with honey, and both the making of it and the smallness of any one bee's contribution are their own kind of wonder. Honey begins as nectar, the thin, sweet water of flowers. A forager drinks it into her honey stomach and carries it home, where she passes it to a house bee mouth to mouth. That bee works it, adding enzymes, passing it on the nectar, moving bee to bee, and then it is laid in the cells where the bees fan it with their wings to drive off water until the thin nectar thickens into dense, lasting honey. Then they cap the cell with wax, sealing a store that can keep almost unspoiled for an extraordinarily long time. The labor behind even a little honey is staggering. A single worker bee across her entire foraging life of a few weeks produces only about 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey, a smear, a fraction of a drop. Her whole working existence yields almost nothing on its own. A jar of honey, then, is the summed life's work of thousands of bees, each contributing her tiny fraction, the small smears, accumulating into something you can hold. To fill it, foragers between them fly a distance that adds up to circling the planet, visiting flowers in the millions. The honey on a spoon is not a product. It is a monument, the pooled labor of countless brief lives, each giving its 1/12 of a teaspoon, the wonder lying not in any one bee's share, but in how many shares it took. A real puzzle sits at the heart of this whole story, and it is worth pausing on because it explains why the bees are Africanized and not simply mixed. When African bees breed with the European bees already in the Americas, the African traits do not blend away. They take over. You might expect that interbreeding would dilute the African temperament, that generations of mixing with calmer European stock would soften the offspring toward the middle. It did not happen. Instead, the African characteristics proved strongly dominant, persisting and spreading through the hybrid population, so that the bees across the invaded range remained essentially African in their behavior and biology, rather than settling into a gentle blend. Several forces drive this. African genes appear to carry a built-in advantage in this setting, expressing strongly in the hybrids. The African bees swarm and reproduce so much faster that they simply flood the gene pool, outbreeding the European population. And their mating biology tilts the field further in their favor, so that African lineages dominate the next generation again and again. The result is that Africanized is the right word, not hybrid. The population is African in all the ways that matter, the European contribution swamped and overwritten. It is a striking case of one lineage's traits, refusing to be diluted, asserting themselves through dominance and sheer reproductive speed, until the mixed population is, for all practical purposes, simply the African bee wearing a thin European trace. The takeover at the level of behavior is underneath the takeover at the level of genes. We have seen that winter halted the northward march. Look closer at why, because the bee's vulnerability to cold is itself rooted in the very traits that make them so successful in the warmth, and it may be the one thing that ultimately contains them. A honeybee colony survives winter by hunkering down, stockpiling large stores of honey through the good season, then clustering tight and living off those reserves through the months when no food can be gathered. European bees shaped by temperate winters are good at this, thrifty, well-provisioned, built to endure long cold. The African lineage, shaped by a tropical world with no true winter, is not. It tends to store less to keep raising brood and consuming resources, rather than battening down, and to abscond when conditions turn hard rather than tough it out. Those tropical habits are exactly what make the bees struggle, where winters are long and severe. A colony that does not stockpile enough, that keeps spending instead of saving, that may simply pick up and leave, is poorly equipped to ride out months of killing cold, and so the northern front falters where the winters lengthen. This is why the cold may be the lasting boundary. The traits that make the Africanized bee so formidable in the warm south, its restless reproduction, its refusal to hoard, its readiness to move, are the same traits that leave it ill-suited to the frozen north. Its greatest strengths, carried into the wrong climate, become the weakness that stops it. The bee is contained in the end not by anything we did, but by the shadow side of the very biology that made it unstoppable everywhere warm. Stand back and take in the whole arc of the numbers, because it ends in a figure that is hard to hold in the mind, from a few dozen queens in one place in 1 year to countless billions of bees across 2 continents. It started with a small importation, a few dozen African queens brought to Brazil, of which only a handful ultimately seeded the wild population. From that tiny founding stock, everything that followed descended. The swarming engine took over those founding colonies, budding into more, the more budding into more again. The population compounding season after season as the front rolled across the hemisphere. Decades later, the descendants of that handful number in the billions. Uncountable colonies spread across the warm half of South America, all of Central America, much of Mexico, and the southern United States, every one of them tracing back to those few imported queens. An entire continental population, one of the most abundant insects across vast regions, sprung from a founding stock you could have held in a single small box. There is a vertiginous wonder in the disproportion. A few dozen queens, one accident, 1 year, and from that pinprick of a beginning, billions of bees filling 2 continents within a single human lifetime. It is the swarming arithmetic carried to its conclusion, life's capacity to multiply, shown at full terrifying power. Everything in this story, every attack, every colony and every wall from Argentina to Texas, flows from that one tiny seed compounded without pause until it covered half a world. There is a final twist to the wonder of these bees, and it complicates the whole picture of them as simply a menace. They are tremendous survivors, hardy and resilient, where the gentle European bees are increasingly failing. Across much of the world, managed European honeybees have been in trouble, battered by parasites, diseases, and the mysterious collapses that have killed off colonies in alarming numbers. The Africanized bee weathers much of this far better. Its restless habits, its vigorous swarming, its hygienic vigor and general toughness make it markedly more resistant to some of the very pests and stresses that devastate European stock. Where pampered European colonies sicken and die, the wild Africanized ones often persist untended and unbothered. That resilience is woven from the same traits that make them dangerous and hard to manage: the relentless reproduction, the readiness to abscond from trouble, the fierce defensiveness that keeps predators at bay. The bee that is so difficult to live near is by the same token extraordinarily difficult to kill off. It complicates the easy story. The killer bee is not simply a problem to be eliminated, it is also one of the hardiest honeybees on the planet, thriving where others fail, carrying the species' vigor in an age when honeybees badly need it. The wonder here has an edge of irony. The lineage we most fear may also be, in sheer survival terms, the most successful, and that durability will shape its place in our future as much as its sting ever has. Pull all of it together: the weeks-long workers, the years-long queen, the millions born and spent, the swarming that divides one colony into 2, and you arrive at the deepest wonder of the hive. It is in a real sense immortal, though. Every part of it dies. No single bee lasts. The workers burn out in weeks. Even the long-lived queen ages and fails in a few years and is replaced. Everybody in the colony is mortal brief, continually dying and being swept away. And yet the colony itself need never die. As old bees perish, new ones hatch to take their place. As the old queen fails, a new queen is raised to reign. And when the colony grows strong, it swarms, dividing itself and continuing in 2 bodies where there was 1. The whole flows on unbroken across the deaths of all its members. A colony can persist in this way for years or decades, far beyond the life of any bee within it. A continuous living thing made entirely of impermanent parts, like a flame that keeps burning, though no particular bit of fuel lasts, or a river that stays a river though no drop of water remains. This is the marvel to carry out of the whole stage. The thing in the wall is not 50,000 insects. It is one organism potentially immortal that happens to be built out of mortal bees, the way a body is built out of dying cells, renewing itself faster than it loses itself, dividing to escape its own ending, a single life sustained across countless small deaths. We fear the bees, but the real animal, the one that endures, is the deathless colony they briefly replaceably compose. Before we leave the realm of wonder for the weight of where these bees came from, let one number land fully, because the reproductive power of a single colony, made concrete, is the engine under this entire story. Take one strong queen at her peak, laying around 2,000 eggs a day. Hold that beside a human comparison and the scale becomes vivid. A human mother across her entire life might bear a handful of children. This single bee produces every single day the equivalent of a small town's worth of offspring, and then does it again the next day and the next for years. In the time it takes you to read this sentence, she has laid another egg. By this time tomorrow, 2,000 more bees will be on their way to being born from her alone. Now multiply. Each colony she founds can swarm and become many. Each of those many more. Run that compounding across a few warm years, and the descendants of one queen number in the millions. Run it across the decades of the invasion, and they reach the billions we have already counted. That is the whole story in a single thread of arithmetic. The attacks, the spread, the colonies in every southern wall, all of it is just this number. The queen's daily thousands compounded without pause across time and a continent. The wonder of the hive and the menace of the killer bee turn out to be the same fact seen twice: life's raw capacity to make more of itself. Faster than anything can keep up with running flat out from a single tireless body, laying one egg a minute in the dark. So before we ask how all this began, stand for a moment beside the wonder itself, not the attack but the thing in its quieter, stranger glory, a wild swarm hanging in the open on an ordinary afternoon. You would find it on a low branch, perhaps in the warm country, a great dark teardrop the size of a football or larger, made entirely of bees, thousands of them gripping one another in a living mass, the whole cluster faintly shifting, breathing, alive. A low hum comes off it, steady and deep, not the roar of war but the sound of a colony simply being. Bees lift away and return, scouts come and go. Somewhere in the warm heart of it, unseen, the queen waits while her colony decides its future. It is in this moment, not dangerous at all. A swarm between homes, full of honey and intent on finding a house, is famously docile. It has nothing yet to defend. You could stand a few feet from one of the most feared insects on earth and watch it do nothing but hang there, holding itself together, keeping its queen warm, waiting for its scouts to bring word of home. Hold that image. This is the animal whole. Not the furious cloud over a fallen victim, but this patient hanging mass, this single body of thousands keeping itself alive in the open air, deciding by means we are only beginning to understand where to live next. It is a marvel plainly and simply, and the last hard question of its story is not what it is or what it can do, but how this particular bee of all the bees on earth came to be hanging here at all, in Texas, in Arizona, in a hemisphere that was never its own. So here at last is how it began, not in a jungle, not by nature, but by a latch left open on a day in Brazil. In the 1950s, African honeybees were brought to Brazil for an experiment and kept under control at a research station near Sao Paulo. The African queens and their colonies were managed carefully, fitted with special guards over the hive entrances meant to keep the larger queens from escaping while letting the smaller workers pass. Then, in 1957, the accident. A visiting beekeeper, finding the guards in place and perhaps not understanding their purpose, removed them, and 26 African queens with swarms of their bees escaped into the Brazilian countryside. That was the whole of it. Not a disaster of fire or flood, not a grand event, a few queens, a removed guard, an afternoon. But those 26 queens were the founding stock of everything that followed, every colony and every wall, every attack, every death, the entire billion-strong sweep across 2 continents. The killer bee did not come from the wild. It came from an open gate and a handful of escaped queens on an ordinary day by mistake. It is tempting to look for a villain in that open gate. There isn't one. The man behind the experiment was a respected scientist with an entirely reasonable goal, and that is part of the weight of this story. He was a geneticist studying bees in Brazil, and he was trying to solve a real problem. The European honeybees that beekeepers had brought to the tropics of South America were poorly suited to the climate. They were sluggish there, unproductive, struggling in the heat, bad at making honey in a land that wanted more of it. He reasoned that African bees evolved in a hot climate might do far better, and that crossing them with the local European stock could yield a bee both productive and well adapted, a better bee for the tropics. It was sound thinking. The African bees were indeed superbly adapted to heat, vigorous, hardy, prolific. What the plan underestimated was temperament, how fiercely defensive the African bees were, how strongly that defensiveness would carry into the hybrids rather than washing out, and how completely those traits would dominate. The scientist meant to build a better honeybee, and in one sense he succeeded. The Africanized bee is a magnificent tropical survivor. He simply could not foresee that its success would come bundled with a ferocity that no one wanted in a package no one could recall. Sit with that for a moment, because it matters to how we judge this whole affair. The experiment was not reckless folly. It made sense biologically and humanly, and that is exactly why its outcome is so sobering. Biologically, the logic was sound. Match the organism to the climate. European bees floundered in tropical Brazil. Crossing them to get a heat-adapted productive honeybee was a reasonable application of everything known about breeding and adaptation. Plenty of agriculture works precisely this way, importing better-suited stock to improve a struggling one. Humanly, the motive was good. More productive bees meant more honey, better pollination, stronger livelihoods for beekeepers and farmers across a developing region. This was science in service of food and prosperity, not vanity or recklessness. The scientist was trying to help people with a method his field endorsed. And still it went the way it went. That is the uncomfortable lesson folded into the killer bee. Not that someone was careless or wicked, but that careful, well-intentioned, scientifically sound action can produce consequences vast and irreversible. The plan was good. The reasoning was good. The people were trying to do good. And the result was a continent-spanning change that no one chose and no one can undo. For all the dread attached to its name, the killer bee is first and most of the time a honeybee, and honeybees do one thing for the living world that almost nothing else does as well. They pollinate. As Africanized bees forage across the warm Americas, moving flower to flower for nectar and pollen, they carry pollen with them, fertilizing plants as they go. They pollinate wild plants, holding together natural ecosystems, and they pollinate crops, the fruits and nuts and vegetables that depend on insect visitors to set their harvest. In much of their range, they have simply become the dominant honeybee, and so they have inherited much of the essential pollinating work that honeybees do. This is the side of them the fearful name erases. The same insect that kills livestock and overwhelms the unlucky spends the overwhelming majority of its existence doing the quiet, indispensable labor that feeds ecosystems and people alike. It forces a harder, truer view of the animal. It is not a monster that happens to live among us. It is a pollinator that happens when its nest is threatened to be dangerous. Strip away the legend, and what remains is a working honeybee, going flower to flower under the hot sun, doing the oldest and most necessary job its kind has ever done, the same job performed by the same body that we depend on the gentle bees to do everywhere else. Push that further, because it is the part most at odds with the killer bee's reputation. In much of its range, this feared insect is not just ecologically useful but economically vital. People depend on it. Across South and Central America, the Africanized bee has become the backbone of beekeeping. Beekeepers there did not abandon it, they learned to work with it, and it rewards them. It is a vigorous, productive honeybee, often outproducing the gentler European stock in the tropical climates where the Europeans struggled. Whole honey industries across the region rest on these bees, and beyond the honey, their pollination underpins the crops that feed and employ millions. So in the places where they have lived longest, the killer bees are not regarded purely as a menace. They are a managed resource, dangerous, demanding of care and respect, but valuable, woven into agriculture and livelihood rather than simply feared. This is the weight that the sensational name hides. To the rancher who lost an animal, the bee is a killer. To the beekeeper down the road, the same bee is a living. Both are true. The Africanized bee sits in that uncomfortable double role, genuinely dangerous and genuinely valuable at once, and the people who live with it longest tend to see more clearly than those who only fear it, that you cannot tally its harm without also tallying the food and the work and the survival it quietly provides. If the bee is both dangerous and valuable, the obvious question is how anyone lives and works with it, and the answer is a quiet craft that has grown up around the killer bee, turning a fearsome insect into a manageable one. The key lies in the queen because she determines the temperament of her colony. Her daughters inherit her disposition. So the central technique is requeening. A beekeeper who finds a colony too aggressive can remove its Africanized queen and replace her with a gentle, selectively bred European one. As the old defensive workers die off over the following weeks, and the new queen's calmer daughters replace them, the colony's whole temperament shifts toward docility. The hive is in effect re-tempered from the top. Around this central move sits a whole practice of care, handling colonies with more caution and protective gear, sighting hives away from people and animals, watching for and managing the readiness to swarm, staying alert to the bees' quicker tempers. It is a real and learned skill, and it works. Beekeepers across the Americas keep Africanized bees productively and safely by understanding them, by respecting the temperament and managing it rather than wishing it away. The lesson embedded in the craft is the same one that runs through the whole story. The bee cannot be made not dangerous, but it can be understood. And understanding is what turns an uncontrollable terror into a difficult but workable partner. Now set the killer bee against the larger crisis facing its gentle cousins, because the timing raises a genuinely unsettling possibility about its place in our future. The managed European honeybees that pollinate so much of the world's food have been suffering. For years now, beekeepers have reported heavy and sometimes catastrophic losses, colonies weakening and dying from a tangle of causes: parasitic mites, diseases, pesticides, poor nutrition, and the mysterious mass die-offs that drew global alarm. The pollinators we most depend on have been, in many places, in serious trouble. The Africanized bee, by contrast, is thriving, hardy, resistant, surviving untended where pampered European colonies collapse. And this raises a question that sits uneasily in a world where the gentle honeybee is faltering. Might the tougher, fiercer Africanized bee come to fill the gap simply by outlasting the alternative? It is an unwelcome thought for many. The bee we feared as an invader may in the long run prove to be the bee that survives, the one whose resilience matches the hard new conditions, even as its temperament makes it harder to live with. There is no clean resolution here, only a tension worth sitting in. The most difficult honeybee may also be the most durable, and a future short on pollinators may have less luxury than we would like to be choosy about which bees it can keep. There is a thread of hope in this story, and honesty requires both holding it up and admitting how uncertain it is. There are signs in places that the killer bee may be growing gentler over time. As Africanized bees spread into regions with established European bee populations and beekeeping, they continue to interbreed, and there is some evidence that at the edges of their range and over long stretches of time, the hybrid populations can drift somewhat calmer than the fierce bees of the invasion's leading front. Where European genes are abundant and beekeepers actively select for gentleness, the sharpest edge of the aggression may in some places be slowly worn down. But the hope comes heavily qualified. The African traits proved strongly dominant precisely because they resisted dilution, and across most of the range the bees have remained robustly defensive for decades, with little sign of softening into placidity. Researchers still study and debate how much, where, and whether the temperament is truly mellowing or merely varying from place to place. So the picture is genuinely mixed, and it would be dishonest to tie it in a bow. In some regions, under some conditions, the bee may be inching towards something more manageable. In most, it remains very much itself. Whether time and mixing will eventually blunt the killer bee, or whether its dominant ferocity will simply persist, is one of the real open questions. A thing we are still watching unfold with no settled answer yet. Recall that the cold is what finally stopped the bees' advance. Now add the one development that could unsettle even that boundary, and the weight of it becomes clear. The climate that drew the line is itself changing. The Africanized bee's northern limit is set by winter, by the long, hard cold that its tropical biology cannot endure. That boundary has held for years, a frost line the bees could not cross. But a warming climate moves frost lines. As winters grow milder and shorter across the temperate zones, the conditions that once killed northward pushing colonies may ease, and regions that were too cold for the bees may slowly become survivable. This means the map of the killer bee may not be fixed. The containment we have, leaned on the comforting belief that the cold north is simply off-limits to them, depends on a climate that is no longer holding still. As the world warms, the bee's potential range could creep northward with it into places that have so far been spared. It is a sobering convergence, a problem we created by moving one bee, met by a boundary set by nature, now potentially loosened by another larger thing we have set in motion. The killer bee's spread and the warming of the planet are separate stories, but they may yet intersect, the second quietly erasing the limit that has held the first in check, and extending the reach of the swarm into a future we are still busy making warmer. For all that has been studied, the killer bee keeps its share of mysteries, and it is worth naming them plainly, because the honest edge of this story is how much remains genuinely unknown. Scientists still cannot fully predict or explain the swings in a colony's defensiveness, why one colony erupts at the faintest disturbance, while a neighbor tolerates far more, why the same colony seems calmer some days and murderous on others. The genetics of the aggression are mapped only in part. Researchers continue to untangle which genes, in which combinations, with which environmental triggers produce the temperament, and much of the detail remains open. How the colony integrates its countless signals into the precise tipping point where defense becomes a full assault is understood only roughly. Even the big questions of the future resist confident answers. How far the bees will ultimately spread, whether and where they will truly mellow, how they will interact with a changing climate and a struggling population of European bees. These remain genuinely uncertain, debated, unresolved. There is a humility ode here. We made this bee, watched it cross a hemisphere, studied it for decades, and still we cannot fully say why it does what it does, or what it will do next. The killer bee is not a solved problem with a known shape. It is an ongoing piece of science still being worked out, still capable of surprising the people who know it best. We released it before we understood it, and in important ways we are still trying to catch up. Underneath the biology runs a harder question, and the killer bee poses it as sharply as almost anything in our history. What do we owe the world when we reshape life and then lose our grip on it? We took an organism, moved it across the planet, bred it toward our purposes, and then by an accident but downstream of a deliberate act released something we could not recall. It spread, it killed, it changed 2 continents, and there was no undoing it. The genie did not go back in the bottle. Whatever the killer bee has done and will do, it is now a permanent part of the Americas, beyond our power to remove. This is not only a story about bees. It is a small, vivid case of a much larger pattern, our growing ability to alter living things set against our limited ability to foresee or control what follows. The intentions were good, the science was sound, and still the result escaped us entirely. The ethical weight is not really about guilt. It is about responsibility and humility. When we engineer life, when we move species, breed new traits, and now edit genes directly, we take on consequences that may outrun us by centuries and refuse every attempt to reverse them. The killer bee is a warning written in a living thing, that the power to change life arrives long before the power to control the change, and that some doors once open do not close again. We are opening more of them now, faster than we ever have. It is worth correcting the record honestly, because part of the weight of this story is how badly our fear has outrun the actual danger, and how the legend took on a life the facts never justified. The killer bee arrived in the popular imagination wrapped in panic, lurid films, breathless headlines, a name engineered for dread. It became a symbol of unstoppable menace, an insect monster swarming up from the south. And against that towering image, the real toll, while genuine and tragic, is far smaller. Deaths in the United States from these bees number in the modest dozens over decades, every one a tragedy but a far cry from the apocalypse the legend promised. Most people in their range will live their whole lives without a dangerous encounter. The fear, in other words, has been disproportionate to the risk. The bee is dangerous, and the danger is real, but the terror attached to its name belongs more to the story we told than to the bodies it has actually claimed. There is a lesson in that gap worth carrying. Our sense of danger is shaped powerfully by narrative, by image, by the vividness of a threat rather than its true scale, and a frightening story can loom far larger in the mind than statistics ever warrant. The killer bee earned real caution and never earned the panic. Holding both of those at once, taking the genuine risk seriously while refusing the inflated dread, is its own kind of clear sight, and the bee in the end is a lesson in learning to tell the size of a fear from the size of its cause. Widen the lens all the way, because the killer bee is one chapter in a story far older and larger than itself, the long history of humans moving life around the planet and remaking nature in the process. For thousands of years, deliberately and accidentally, we have carried species across the world, crops and livestock, but also rats and weeds and insects and disease, planted and stowed away and set loose far from where they began. Some transformed continents. The Africanized bee is simply a recent, well-documented case of a very old human habit. We move living things and the living things. Freed in new lands, do what life does: spread, adapt, and reshape the world to fit themselves. Seen this way, the killer bee is less an aberration than an example. It joins a long roster of organisms we have relocated and lost control of each one, altering its new home in ways we did not plan and cannot reverse. And the lens matters because it locates the real story, not in the bee, but in us. The killer bee did not invade. It was brought. Like so much of what we call invasive, it is the consequence of human movement and human ambition, a piece of nature rearranged by us and then continuing under its own momentum. To understand it is to see ourselves as a geological force, a species that has spent its whole history redrawing the map of life, usually without knowing what the new map would say, and only lately beginning to grasp how thoroughly and how permanently we have rewritten the world we live in. Hold two facts together now, because their collision is the sharpest irony in the whole story, and a real one, not a tidy one. The first, the world faces a pollinator crisis. The insects that fertilize our crops and wild plants are under pressure everywhere, the gentle honeybees among them faltering, and with them a portion of the food security of the human species. We need pollinators badly, and we are losing them. The second, the killer bee, is a superb pollinator, hardy and thriving, doing exactly the work the failing bees can no longer reliably do across the warm Americas. This feared insect is already among the most important pollinators there. Set those side by side and the irony lands with weight. The bee we named for killing may be in the balance one that feeds us a vital pollinator wearing the name of a murderer. The same creature that claims a few dozen lives a decade sustains through its pollination an incalculable amount of life and food. This is the knot the story finally ties us into. The killer bee refuses to be simply the monster we made it. It is dangerous and it is indispensable, a taker of some lives and a quiet sustainer of countless others, and the name we gave it captures only the smaller, more frightening half. In an age desperate for pollinators, the killer may turn out to be, on the whole, far more our ally than our enemy, and learning to see it that way may be one of the harder and more necessary adjustments the story asks of us. The killer bee is not alone, and that is the point that gives this whole story its real reach. It is one of a vast and growing number of living things we have set loose and cannot retrieve. The list is long and worldwide. Cane toads spread across a continent, killing the predators that try to eat them. Carp choking river systems, rabbits overrunning grasslands, snakes that emptied an island's forests of birds, plants and insects, and pathogens beyond counting, each carried by us into a new world and then unstoppable within it. Every one began as an introduction, sometimes careless, sometimes, like the bee, well-meaning, and became permanent. What unites them is irreversibility. Once a living thing establishes itself across a landscape, breeding and spreading on its own, there is almost never any taking it back. We can sometimes slow these things, manage them, fence them in a little. We almost never undo them. That is the weight the killer bee shares with all of them, and it is the heaviest part of its lesson. Our power to introduce vastly exceeds our power to remove. We can open the gate, but we cannot afterward herd what escaped back through it. In an age when we are moving life faster than ever, and now learning to edit it at the level of the gene, that asymmetry should sober us. The killer bee is one small buzzing reminder of a rule we keep relearning the hard way, that life once set loose has a will of its own, and that the consequences of releasing it are measured not in years, but in the permanent reshaping of the world. Bring it back to the present, because this is not a closed case in a history book. The killer bee is a story still being written, and scientists are still right now tracking where it goes. Researchers continue to map the bee's range year by year, watching the edges, monitoring how far north they hold, whether warming winters let them creep further, how their genetics shift as they mix with local populations, how their temperament varies across the vast territory they occupy. The spread that began in 1957 has not settled into a final fixed map. It remains a moving, living thing studied in real time, and the open questions are real ones. Exactly how far they will ultimately reach, how a changing climate will redraw their limits, whether they will gentle or stay fierce, what role they will finally play as other bees decline, none of these have settled answers. The science is genuinely ongoing. That is worth holding as the story nears its end. We are not looking back on a finished event. We are living inside an unfinished one. Somewhere in the warm country tonight, the range is being mapped, the genetics sampled, the colonies counted, the slow work of trying to understand after the fact the thing we released before we understood it. The killer bee is not history. It is a question still open, a spread still underway, a piece of the living world still moving and still being watched. So, the story turns at the end into a question pointed not at the bee but at us. And it is the one worth carrying out of all of this. Knowing what we know now, would we do it again? Not the bee specifically, but the larger act it stands for. We are right now more capable than ever of reshaping life. We move species still. We breed new traits. And now we edit genomes directly with tools of staggering precision, capable of changing organisms and even erasing whole species deliberately, including, as it happens, serious proposals to engineer the genes of dangerous insects. The power the Brazilian scientist had is a faint shadow of the power we now hold. And the lesson of the killer bee is not never act. It is that good intentions and sound reasoning are not enough, that consequences can outrun us, escape us, and refuse to be recalled, and that we must reckon with that possibility before we open the gate, not after. Would we do it again? In a sense, we are doing it again constantly at a scale and precision the 1950s could not dream of. The killer bee asks us to bring to that work a humility its own creator lacked, to remember every time we reach to reshape the living world that the bee got out, that it could not be put back, and that the distance between what we intend and what we unleash is wider and more permanent than we like to believe. It is not an argument against the power. It is a demand that we wield it, knowing what it costs to be wrong. And so we end where the bee itself never does, in the present tense, with the story still unfinished and the swarm still in motion. Somewhere tonight, in the warm dark of the southern country, a colony hangs in a wall that no one has noticed. Its queen is laying one egg a minute, as she has all day and will all night. Its foragers will lift off at first light to pollinate the fields and orchards we depend on. And at its edges far to the north, the range is still being tested against the cold still creeping, season by season, toward a frost line that a warming world is slowly drawing back. This was never in the end a simple monster story. The killer bee is a marvel and a menace, a pollinator and a killer, a magnificent survivor and a permanent mistake, all of it at once, none of it cancelling the rest. It is the dread we opened with, and the wonder we found along the way, and it is above all ours, a thing we made, released, and could not take back. That is the weight it leaves behind. The oldest lesson wearing wings, that life is more powerful than our plans for it, that what we set loose keeps going long after we have lost the thread. The swarm is still out there right now, moving through the dark, and the years carrying its fierce inheritance northward into a future we are still shaping, a small, humming reminder that we have always been better at beginning things than at knowing how they end.